The dog hit the emergency room doors like a living missile. No warning, no hesitation. 60 pounds of Belgian Malinois muscle blew past the security guard, ignored every shouted command, and carved a straight line through the crowded corridor of Ridgeway Memorial Hospital past gurneys, past doctors, past the stunned faces of soldiers still in field gear. It stopped in front of Maren Vale. She was standing beside a supply cart, a saline bag in one hand, going absolutely nowhere important, a quiet nurse in faded scrubs. The kind of person a room full of people looked through without meaning to. The dog sat down at her feet like it had found the only fixed point in the universe. Then it dropped something from its mouth onto the floor between them. A tactical wristband, scorched at the edges. Still legible. Gray Falcon. The hallway went silent. Dr. Conrad Vane stood 10 feet away, mid-sentence, forgotten. Corporal Owen Rusk stood at the doorway, the dog's handler, completely at a loss. A dozen soldiers and nurses stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because nobody in that hospital, not one person, had any idea who Maren Vale really was. If you want more stories like this, real, human, and worth your time, hit subscribe. We tell them every week. Coldwater, Wyoming did not attract attention. That was, as far as Maren Vale was concerned, its single greatest quality. The town sat in a shallow valley between two mountain ridges, the kind of place that showed up on maps only because someone had to put a dot somewhere. Winter arrived in October and stayed through April. The population hovered around 11,000. The biggest employer was Ridgeway Memorial Hospital, a 2-story brick building with 46 beds, one functioning MRI machine, and a staff that had worked together long enough to know exactly where everyone stood in the unspoken hierarchy. Maren had worked there for 3 years. She knew her place in that hierarchy without needing anyone to explain it. She was 31 years old. She wore the same rotation of faded scrubs. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a simple tie. No jewelry, no small talk beyond what the job required. She was always on time. She never called in sick. She caught things, medication dosages that didn't add up, vital signs trending in the wrong direction, patients who said they felt fine but whose eyes said otherwise, and she flagged them quietly, without drama, without demanding credit. Her coworkers thought she was competent. A few thought she was cold. Most simply didn't think about her much at all. That suited Maren fine. Tessa Rowe had been at Ridgeway for 14 months, which was long enough to understand the rhythms of the place, but not long enough to stop being bothered by them. She noticed things about Maren that the senior staff had long since stopped seeing. The way Maren's hands never shook, even during the worst trauma cases. The way she positioned herself in a room always near the door, always with a clear sightline to the most critical patient. The way she sometimes paused mid-task and tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear, and then moved to a patient's bedside 30 seconds before the monitor alarmed. Tessa had asked about it once early on. Maren had said, "You learn the patterns." Then she'd gone back to work. What Tessa noticed more than anything else was that Maren never fought back. Dr. Conrad Vane was the chief of medicine at Ridgeway Memorial, and he ran the department the way certain men ran things when they had gone unchallenged for too long. He was technically skilled and institutionally untouchable, and he used both facts like weapons. He corrected people in front of their peers. He dismissed concerns without looking up from his charts. He had a particular talent for making a person feel that their presence in the room was a minor inconvenience he was generously tolerating. He did this to most of the staff. He did it to Maren more than anyone. Vale. The way he said her name carried a specific weight, the weight of a man who had already decided the answer before asking the question. "Did I ask for your assessment, or did I ask you to prepare the IV?" Maren would nod, turn back to the IV, and say nothing. Tessa, watching from across the room, would feel her jaw tighten. She could never understand it. Maren was clearly better than Vane gave her credit for. Why didn't she say anything? She had no way of knowing that silence, for Maren Vale, was a survival strategy built over years and paid for in ways that didn't show up in any personnel file. There was one other detail worth noting. Small, easy to miss. Dr. Conrad Vane had a particular reaction to certain words. Deployment, field surgery, operational theater. A slight stiffening in his shoulders. A pause before he changed the subject. The kind of discomfort that looked like irritation on the surface but sat too deep for that. No one at Ridgeway had ever connected it to anything. Not yet. What no one at Ridgeway Memorial knew was this. Before Coldwater. Before the faded scrubs and the quiet shifts and the careful invisibility. Before she had become the kind of person a room looked through, Maren Vale had been someone else entirely. She had served as a combat medic attached to a special operations unit. Her call sign had been Gray Falcon. She had worked in conditions that bore no resemblance to the clean corridors of a Wyoming hospital under fire, in the dark, with whatever equipment she could carry, and whatever time she had left before a soldier stopped breathing. She had worked alongside a Belgian Malinois named Ranger, a military working dog whose instincts the entire unit had learned to trust. And then something had happened. Something she did not talk about, did not write down, and had spent 3 years trying to bury under the ordinary weight of ordinary days. She had left the military. She had come to Coldwater. She had become Maren Vale, quiet nurse, unremarkable, unnoticed. It had almost worked. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon in late February. A military convoy, 6 vehicles moving through the mountain pass 12 miles north of Coldwater, had gone off the road. Ice, a jackknifed supply truck, and a 40-foot drop off the shoulder. 4 soldiers dead at the scene. 9 more en route to Ridgeway Memorial, with injuries ranging from fractures and lacerations to internal bleeding and head trauma. Ridgeway Memorial had 46 beds and 1 trauma surgeon on duty. The hospital did not fall apart immediately. It fell apart in stages, the way underprepared systems always do: first a delay, then a miscommunication, then 2 nurses reaching for the same equipment at the same time, while a third stood waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Dr. Vane stood in the center of the emergency bay and issued orders in the clipped, authoritative tone of a man who expected the chaos to organize itself around him. It did not. Maren said nothing. She moved. She had the trauma bay restocked before the first ambulance arrived, pulling supplies from the secondary cart that most of the staff forgot existed. When the first soldier came through the doors, a young sergeant with a compound fracture of the left femur and a blood pressure dropping faster than the attending had registered, Maren was already at the bedside with a pressure cuff and a second IV line ready. She didn't announce it. She just did it. Dr. Livia Sloan, one of 2 internists on shift, caught it. Sloan was 34, careful, technically solid, and honest enough with herself to recognize when someone in the room was operating at a different level. She watched Maren move through the trauma bay and felt something she couldn't immediately name, not quite recognition, but something close to watching a person speak a language fluently that everyone else in the room was still sounding out letter by letter. The soldier with the femur fracture stabilized. The next one came in blast concussion, neck stabilized but not confirmed. Maren had already flagged him to Sloan before the paramedic finished the handoff report. Pupils unequal, Maren said, quietly, standing 2 feet back. Left sluggish. He's been conscious the whole transport, but he's not tracking right. Sloan looked. Maren was right. The soldier went to imaging in under 4 minutes. Across the room, Dr. Vane had noticed. He didn't say anything in the moment the volume of incoming patients made any individual confrontation impractical. But Tessa Rowe, moving between Bay 3 and the supply corridor, saw the look on Vane's face when he watched Maren redirect a second-year resident away from a procedural mistake without raising her voice. It wasn't the look of a supervisor observing a capable employee. It was something harder than that. Something that wanted to find a problem where the performance kept refusing to give him one. Among the soldiers brought in that afternoon was Corporal Owen Rusk, 28 years old, assigned to the K-9 unit traveling with the convoy. He came through the doors on his own feet, a deep laceration along his left forearm from broken vehicle glass, a probable cracked rib from where he'd been thrown against the doorframe, and the slightly unfocused expression of someone running on adrenaline just beginning to wear off. He sat down on the chair Maren pointed him to without argument. She worked quickly, cleaned the laceration, assessed the rib, checked his pupils, asked him 4 questions in a tone so level it took him a moment to realize he'd answered all of them. His arm was sutured and wrapped in 11 minutes. He watched her hands the entire time. No wasted motion. No hesitation. "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "Suturing?" Maren said. "In the field," Rusk said. She tied off the last stitch, looked up at him for exactly 1 second, then pulled off her gloves and moved to the next bay. Rusk sat there a moment, holding his wrapped arm, watching her go. He filed it away without knowing why. His dog, Ranger, was still secured in the K-9 transport vehicle outside Calm, waiting, as he always was. By the time the last patient was stabilized, Ridgeway Memorial looked like it had survived something. Equipment scattered, staff pale with exhaustion, the sharp antiseptic smell of the trauma bay mixing with cold air still pushing through the propped-open ambulance entrance. Dr. Vane stood at the edge of the room, looking at Maren. The look on his face had nothing to do with gratitude. The transfer notice appeared in Maren's mailbox the following morning. 1 page. Formal letterhead. Signed by Dr. Conrad Vane. Effective the following Monday, Maren Vale was being reassigned from the emergency department to the outpatient clinic routine follow-ups, prescription renewals, blood pressure checks for patients who drove themselves to appointments and drove themselves home. It was not a demotion in any official sense, but everyone at Ridgeway understood what it meant. The outpatient clinic was where careers went quiet. Tessa found Marin reading the notice at the nurse's station. "He can't do that. After yesterday, you were the reason half those soldiers made it through triage." Marin folded the paper and put it in her pocket. "He can do it. He's the chief of medicine. That doesn't make it right." "No," Marin agreed. "It doesn't." She went back to work. She did not file a grievance. She did not pull out the credentials sitting in a sealed envelope at the back of her apartment closet, the certifications, the commendations, the documentation of a career that would have reframed every interaction she'd ever had with Conrad Vane. She had built something here. Small, unglamorous, unremarkable, but hers. The moment she opened that envelope, it was gone. So she said nothing. And on Monday, she reported to the outpatient clinic. She lasted 4 days there before the second convoy came in. A training exercise gone wrong. A vehicle rollover on black ice, followed by a secondary collision with an oncoming supply truck. 7 casualties, 2 critical. The emergency department was already handling a highway accident when the military transport arrived, and charge nurse Helena Price pulled Marin back from the clinic without asking Vane first. Marin walked into the trauma bay and didn't break stride. The resident assigned to Bay 2 had his hands on a soldier mid-20s, 2 broken ribs confirmed, breath sounds diminished on the left, and was moving toward a chest x-ray order when Marin stopped beside him. "Trachea's deviated," she said quietly. "Left side. Listen again." He listened again. His face changed. Tension pneumothorax. Pressure building in the chest cavity, collapsing the lung against the heart. If not relieved in the next few minutes, the soldier's heart would stop. Dr. Livia Sloan came around the curtain, assessed the situation in 2 seconds, and reached for the needle decompression kit. Her hands held until they didn't a slight tremor as she uncapped the needle, the kind that happened when a procedure practiced in simulation was suddenly happening on a person who was actively dying. She looked at Marin. It was not a request. It was something more honest than that. Marin took the kit. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, without hesitation. The needle went in clean. The hiss of released pressure was immediate. The soldier's oxygen saturation began to climb. The resident exhaled. Sloan pressed her hand briefly against the bay curtain, steadying herself. Marin stepped back, stripped her gloves, and turned to the next patient. She had done exactly what the situation required. She had also just crossed a line that Conrad Vane had been waiting for her to cross. He was at the bay entrance when she turned around. He had seen everything. "Vale," he said. "My office. When this is done." Marin met his eyes and nodded once. She already knew what the meeting would be. She already knew she would walk in and accept whatever he handed her. What she didn't know was that something was already coming through the hospital's front doors, something that had tracked her across 3 years and 1,000 miles without ever losing the scent. The dog came through the front entrance at 4:47 inches the afternoon. Corporal Owen Rusk had been cleared from medical hold that morning, returned to light duty with his unit, and had been assigned routine transport with Ranger to the hospital for a follow-up on one of the soldiers from the first convoy. In 14 months as Ranger's handler, Rusk had never seen the animal behave the way he behaved the moment they crossed into the main corridor. Ranger's head came up. His body shifted forward with a focus so complete it was almost physical, like a compass needle snapping to north. He pulled once, hard, against the lead. When Rusk tightened his grip, the dog made a sound low in his chest that Rusk had never heard before. Not aggression, not fear. Something older than either. Then Ranger broke. He hit the end of the lead so hard the clip failed. Rusk lunged after him, shouting the stop command, then the down command, then the animal's name in the tone that had never once failed in 14 months. Ranger ignored all of it. He was already gone down the corridor, past the waiting area, past a cart of clean linens that went spinning off its wheels, past 2 soldiers who jumped back against the wall. He stopped in front of Marin Vale. She was standing beside the nurse's station, a saline bag in her hand, on her way back from the supply room. She had been moving. Now she was completely still. Ranger sat at her feet and set the object in his mouth on the floor between them with the deliberate care of an animal delivering something important. A tactical wristband. Black nylon, scorched along one edge. The name tape faded but legible. Gray Falcon. The corridor went silent. Tessa stood 6 feet away, frozen. Dr. Sloan had come out of Bay 2 at the sound of the commotion and stood at the curtain's edge. 3 soldiers waiting for discharge paperwork were on their feet without knowing when they'd stood up. Dr. Conrad Vane was 10 feet down the corridor, on his way to his office, and he had stopped walking. Rusk reached the edge of the crowd and stopped too. He looked at his dog sitting straight, pressed against the leg of this woman he had treated as a patient 4 days ago, and he remembered. The steady hands. The 4 questions in a tone that didn't waver. You've done this before. In the field. He had filed it away. Now he understood why. Ma'am, he said carefully, do you know my dog? Marin crouched down slowly and picked up the wristband. Ranger pressed his head against her knee and stayed there. His name is Ranger, she said. Her voice was level, but it cost her something. He was assigned to my unit. He was 18 months old when I left. Vane's voice cut through the corridor. What unit? Marin stood and turned around slowly, the wristband in both hands. Special operations, she said. Combat medic. 3 deployments. Grey Falcon, Sloane said softly, reading the name tape. She said it the way someone says a thing out loud to make it real. That was my call sign, Marin said. The silence rearranged itself into something heavier. Vane's face moved through surprise, then calculation, then something that wasn't quite anger but lived in the same neighborhood. The nurse he had transferred to the outpatient clinic. The nurse he had dismissed and moved aside like furniture. 3 combat deployments. A special operations call sign. A military working dog that had blown through a hospital corridor to find her after years apart. He said nothing else, but Marin saw at the shift behind his eyes. Not embarrassment, not guilt, fear. The internal investigation opened the following morning. The formal paperwork cited 3 violations. Failure to disclose prior military medical credentials during hiring, performance of an invasive procedure without direct physician authorization, and conduct creating liability exposure for Ridgeway Memorial Hospital. Dr. Vane and Charge Administrator Maribel Voss had signed both pages. Marin's badge was deactivated before she reached the parking lot. Helena Price read the suspension notice in the break room and set it down with the careful precision of someone controlling a very specific reaction. She had worked at Ridgeway for 19 years. She had seen the inside of more administrative maneuvers than she could count. He moved fast, she said. He was ready, Tessa said from the doorway. Helena looked at her. Yes, he was. Major Karina Belmont arrived at Marin's apartment on the 3rd evening of the suspension. She was 47, compact, with close-cropped gray at her temples and the kind of posture that didn't switch off when the uniform came off. She had known where Marin was for 3 years and had chosen to leave her alone. That choice stopped being right when Ranger broke his lead in a hospital corridor. They sat at the kitchen table. Ranger was on the floor between them, his head on Marin's foot. He went through 4 handlers after you left, Belmont said. Good people. He worked with them. He just never settled. We ran him through reevaluation twice. It wasn't a behavioral issue, Marin said. No, Belmont agreed. It wasn't. She set a folder on the table. A joint military-civilian medical initiative, emergency support capacity for rural hospitals in high-risk geographic areas, trauma expertise, field triage protocols, disaster response. We want you to lead the regional implementation, Belmont said. You'd be based here, but you'd be operating under your actual qualifications. Marin looked at the folder without touching it. Grey Falcon goes back on the record. Grey Falcon was always on the record, Belmont said. You just stopped looking at it. Marin pushed the folder back across the table. Not yet, she said. I'm not ready for that yet. Belmont left the folder on the table when she went. What Marin didn't know, suspended and no longer inside the building, was that 3 people at Ridgeway had spent those same days doing something methodical and long overdue. Helena Price had a filing system she had been adding to for 6 years. Incident reports that had been informally discouraged. Formal complaints submitted and quietly closed without documented resolution. Shift notes where outcomes didn't match official case summaries. She had kept copies of everything in an accordion folder in the bottom drawer of her locker, because she had worked long enough to know that documentation was the only argument that couldn't be interrupted. Tessa had spent 2 evenings writing down dates and specific language, exact words Vane had used, exact situations where he had pressured staff to defer against their own clinical judgment. Dr. Livia Sloane had done something harder. She had called 2 former residents who had left Ridgeway in the past 3 years and asked them directly if they would be willing to speak. Both said yes before she finished the sentence. The detail Helena found on the 2nd day was the one she almost discarded. A staffing record from 7 years prior, a brief consulting engagement, a civilian medical contractor providing advisory services to a military operational command. 6 weeks. The name on the contract, Conrad Vane, M.D. The operation designation was redacted. The dates and location code were there. The name was there. Helena didn't know what it meant yet. She put it in the folder with everything else, a corner piece, The kind you set aside because you don't know where it fits but know it fits somewhere. She was right. She just didn't know it yet. On the fourth day, Tessa called Marin. "We need you to come back. Not to the hospital, to a meeting. Helena's called the board." Marin was quiet for a moment. On the floor beside her, Ranger lifted his head. "Who else is coming?" she asked. "Everyone," Tessa said. "Everyone he ever did this to." The board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in the hospital's second-floor conference room, a room that had never once been used for anything that mattered. It mattered now. Graham Loxley, chairman of the board, arrived to find the room already full. He had expected 6 people. He counted 19 before he stopped counting. They stood along the walls, sat in chairs pulled from adjoining offices, some in scrubs, some in street clothes, all of them present in the particular way that people are present when they have been waiting a long time for a specific moment. Helena Price sat at the center of the table with a manila folder 2 inches thick. Dr. Conrad Vane sat at the far end, flanked by Maribel Voss and the hospital's legal liaison, Patrick Gear, who looked like he had not been adequately briefed on what he was walking into. Marin sat halfway down the table, between Tessa and Dr. Sloan. Ranger was not in the room she had left him with Rusk, who was sitting in the waiting area downstairs with the specific stillness of someone told to stay put, who intended to honor that instruction. Loxley called the meeting to order. Helena opened the folder. What followed was not a dramatic confrontation. It was something more uncomfortable than that. A careful, methodical dismantling that is more damaging than anger, because it cannot be dismissed as emotional. Helena presented documentation in chronological order. 6 years of incident reports, 14 formal complaints, 12 closed without recorded resolution during periods when Vane held a seat on the internal review subcommittee, 3 cases where clinical outcomes had been compromised by staff deferring to Vane's authority against their own judgment. Then the witnesses spoke. A second-year resident named Marcus Webb, who had left Ridgeway 8 months ago for a position in Denver, appeared by video. He described a specific evening, a pediatric patient, a dosage question he had raised, the way Vane had overridden him in front of the family, and the outcome that required corrective intervention the following morning, never formally linked to the original order. A scrub technician named Donna Hartwell, still on staff, described a pattern of behavior in the surgical suite she had reported twice through the anonymous system, and twice received no response. Dr. Sloan spoke last. She was precise and did not editorialize. She described the tension pneumothorax case, the patient, the presentation, her own hesitation, and Marin's intervention in terms that left no interpretive room. The patient had been in immediate danger. The action taken had been correct. The person who took it had the training and certification to take it. Vane had been quiet through most of it. When Loxley invited him to respond, he leaned forward and spoke in the measured tone of a man who had survived institutional challenges before. He called the documentation selectively curated. He called the witnesses colored by personal grievance. He described Marin as a destabilizing presence who had concealed her background, circumvented authority, and placed the hospital at legal and operational risk. Whatever her military background, he said, she is a nurse in this facility. The chain of responsibility exists for a reason, and she has demonstrated repeatedly that she considers herself exempt from it. The room was quiet. Then Marin spoke. She did not raise her voice. She laid out 4 facts in sequence: the patient's presentation, the time available, her documented certifications for the procedure, and the outcome. Then, Dr. Vane is correct that a chain of responsibility exists. He is also correct that I acted outside my standard nursing role. What he has not addressed is that a man was dying, the physician present was unable to act in the time available, and I had the training to do what needed to be done. I would make the same decision again. She stopped there. Loxley looked at her for a long moment, then at the folder in front of Helena, then at Vane. The suspension was lifted before the meeting adjourned. An independent review of Vane's conduct was formally authorized. His administrative authority was temporarily suspended pending the outcome. A real victory. Which meant Conrad Vane had nothing left to lose. The call came in 2 hours after the board meeting ended. A fertilizer processing facility 6 miles north of Coldwater, 11 years without serious incident, had experienced a catastrophic valve failure in its ammonia storage system. The initial report said 12 workers exposed. By the time the first ambulance reached Ridgeway Memorial, the number was 23. The emergency department had not fully restocked from the previous week's military casualties. Helena Price looked at the incoming triage report and started making calls. Marin was back in the building before the 3rd ambulance arrived. Ammonia inhalation presented in layers. Mild cases came in coughing, eyes streaming, disoriented but walking. Moderate cases had bronchospasm and the beginning of pulmonary edema. The severe cases came in on stretchers, cyanotic, with oxygen saturations that made the numbers on monitors feel abstract and the reality of what they meant very concrete. Marin directed the mild cases to the far bay oxygen, observation, bronchodilators on standby. She pulled the 3 most severe into the primary trauma area and called for intubation setup on all 3. She flagged a 4th patient, a woman in her 40s who had walked in insisting she was fine, whose lung sounds told a different story. Chemical burns to the lower airways. She needed aggressive intervention before she understood how much she needed it. Dr. Sloan worked beside Marin through all of it, and the dynamic between them had become efficient and unspoken. Sloan making the calls, Marin providing the clinical picture that allowed those calls to be made correctly and fast. By the time the last patient was stabilized, 2 hours and 40 minutes after the first ambulance, all 23 workers were alive. Dr. Conrad Vane's office was on the 2nd floor, northwest corner. When Marin passed the open door on her way to the documentation station, the room was empty, not temporarily cleared. The desk surface bare, the diplomas gone, hooks still visible, the computer tower missing from under the desk. She stopped in the doorway. Helena appeared beside her. "When?" Marin asked. "Sometime in the last 2 hours," Helena said. "While we were in the department." Rusk came through the emergency entrance 37 minutes later, moving fast despite the taped rib and the laceration above his left eye that had reopened. "The staging area," he said. "Someone came through the perimeter. 2 of our guys are down non-critical. It was fast and coordinated." "Ranger," Marin said. "The kennel was open when we got back." "He's gone." "The person who came through the perimeter, did anyone see them?" "I did," Rusk said. 2 seconds, in the tree line before I went down." He paused. "It was Vane. I'm not wrong about it. I've been looking at that man across tables for 2 weeks." Marin ran the calculation. Vane had emptied his office during the chemical emergency during the 2 hours when the entire department was occupied, when no one was watching the 2nd floor. He hadn't run. He had moved. A man who runs is trying to escape. A man who moves is trying to finish something. She knew what he wanted to finish. Ranger had found her after 3 years, had crossed a hospital corridor to lay something at her feet, had refused to leave her side. Vane knew exactly what that meant to her, and he had taken it. Major Karina Belmont took 11 minutes to reach the hospital. She arrived to find Marin in the ambulance bay, jacket on, car keys in hand, wearing the expression Belmont recognized from 2 deployments, and 1 very bad night in a forward operating base. "Don't," Belmont said. "I know where he is," Marin said. "I know you know. That's why I'm saying don't." Rusk stood behind Belmont, his rib taped, the laceration above his eye closed with surgical strips Marin had applied before he could object. He said nothing. He watched the 2 women, and understood he was witnessing something with a history he wasn't part of. Belmont stepped close, not blocking, just close enough to make the conversation real. "He wants you to come in alone. He wants you angry and uncoordinated and outside any structure that protects you. You walk in there the way you're thinking. You hand him exactly what he needs to burn everything we built in that boardroom this morning." "He has Ranger," Marin said. "I know. We're going to get Ranger. We're going to do it right." The Coldwater Valley Medical Annex had been decommissioned 8 years ago, a satellite facility that had served briefly as overflow capacity before budget cuts made it impractical. It sat on a service road 4 miles east of the main highway, surrounded by scrub pine and the particular silence of buildings that have been empty long enough to forget what they were. Belmont's team had narrowed the location using Vane's vehicle registration, a partial plate from the hospital parking lot camera, and a county property database showing the annex connected to a defunct medical supply company whose registered agent had shared an address with Vane's former private practice. 40 minutes. Marin used the time to review the building's floor plan from county records, identifying entry points, noting which sections were still structurally sound. Rusk studied the floor plan beside her without being asked. When Belmont's team was ready, he was already geared up. "You're injured," Marin said. "Cracked rib," he said. "Not a missing rib." She didn't argue. She had worked with people making the same case in worse condition. They approached the annex from the tree line at dusk. Belmont's team in a standard spread, Marin just behind the lead position, Rusk on her left. The building was dark, except for a single light source in what the floor plan identified as the former procedure room's 2nd corridor, east wing. Marin heard Ranger before she saw him. A low sound, contained, the noise of a trained animal doing what trained animals do when they are frightened and trying not to show it. She stopped moving and breathed. "Steady," Belmont said quietly. "I'm steady," Marin said. She was. Vane was inside the procedure room, standing near the far wall, when they came through the door. Ranger was in a transport crate in the corner, sedative wearing off, alert, pressing against the door. He made a sound when Marin entered that she felt somewhere behind her sternum. Vane looked at the number of people who had come through the door and understood in 1 second that his calculation had been wrong. He had engineered for Marin alone. The dog, the location, the timing, all designed to produce one outcome: a former special operations medic, found in an abandoned facility in a volatile state. That was the story he had needed, the one that made everything from the boardroom collapse under its own weight. Instead, he had a major, 4 military personnel, a corporal, and Marin Vale standing in front of him with the composure of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork. "You should have stayed in that office," he said. "You should have stayed in yours," Marin said. Belmont's team moved to secure the room. Marin walked past Vane to the crate in the corner, crouched down and opened the door. Ranger came out slowly, still unsteady, and pressed his full weight against her side. She put her hand on his head and stayed there while Belmont read Vane his rights. The formal interview took place the following morning at the Coldwater Sheriff's Department, with a JAG officer present alongside 2 civilian investigators and Major Belmont. Vane's attorney had advised him to say nothing. It was the correct advice. Vane didn't take it. He started talking at 9:14 a.m., not because the evidence had overwhelmed him, though it had, but because he had spent a very long night alone with something he had been managing for 7 years, and management had a shelf life. 7 years ago, a military operational command had contracted a civilian medical advisory firm for supplemental oversight at a forward medical station. The contract had been awarded quickly, during a period of significant operational pressure. The firm's primary advisor, Conrad Vane, M.D. The failure had concerned a treatment protocol for blast injury patients. Vane had approved a modified fluid resuscitation guideline, reducing IV fluid volume and rate in the first hour. His stated rationale was logistics, reducing supply weight for forward units. The actual rationale, which emerged only in pieces, was that the contracted supply arrangement tied to the modified protocol generated a financial return that the standard protocol did not. 3 soldiers died during the operational period. 2 of them had presented with injuries that, under standard resuscitation, carried a high survival probability. Under the modified guideline, they had not received adequate volume in time. The after-action review had flagged the discrepancy. It had not flagged Vane by name operational security constraints, limited civilian contractor exposure to formal accountability. The findings had been internally classified, the protocol quietly discontinued, the matter absorbed into the bureaucratic sediment of a system that sometimes chose institutional continuity over accountability. But one person at the forward station had documented everything: the combat medic assigned to the unit, Gray Falcon. She had kept detailed records, patient presentations, times, fluid volumes administered, outcomes. She had submitted a formal report through her chain of command. She had named the protocol. She had named the contractor. The report had been received, acknowledged, and buried. Marin had left the military 6 months later, not forced out, but because she had understood with the clarity that comes from watching a system protect itself that she could not continue inside it. She had taken her records. She had never stopped being the person who filed that report. She had simply stopped expecting anything to come of it. What she had not known was that the contractor's name had been redacted in all documents returned to her unit. She had never seen his face. She had only seen a redaction. Vane had recognized her. Not immediately, it had taken him 3 months after she joined Ridgeway. A combination of her technical precision, a specific phrase she used during a trauma case that appeared verbatim in the report he had spent 7 years trying to forget, and the particular way she positioned herself in a room always with a sightline to the most critical patient. He had known exactly who she was for 2 years and 9 months. Every dismissal, every transfer, every manufactured liability, none of it had been about power or institutional hierarchy. It had been containment. He had been trying to make her small enough, discredited enough, invisible enough, that if the buried report ever surfaced, she would not be a credible witness. Belmont came out of the conference room at 11:30 a.m. and sat down on the bench beside Marin. "He knew for 2 years and 9 months, she said. Marin looked at the far wall. Ranger shifted his head in her lap. "The 3 soldiers," Marin said. "Their families will be notified," Belmont said. "The report you filed, the original, it's being pulled from classification. It'll be part of the formal record." Marin nodded slowly. She had filed that report because it was right. She had watched it disappear and carried that weight for 7 years. It had not disappeared. It had been waiting the same way Ranger had been waiting for the moment when it could finally be what it always was: evidence. The formal hearing before the state medical board took place 3 weeks later. Marin testified for 40 minutes, without notes. She looked at the panel and told them what she had seen, what she had documented, and what she had reported 7 years ago in a forward medical station named without hesitation for the first time since leaving it. She was not the only witness. Marcus Webb testified again. Donna Hartwell testified. Dr. Sloan testified. 2 of the 3 soldiers' families had submitted written statements that the panel chair read into the record with the gravity of someone who understood they were reading the names of people who should still be alive. At the end of the second day, the panel issued its findings. Conrad Vane's medical license was revoked. The criminal referral covering the fraudulent contract, the falsified protocol documentation, the assault on military personnel, and the theft and unlawful detention of a military working dog was forwarded to federal prosecutors. The panel's written opinion described his conduct as a sustained and deliberate pattern of placing personal interest above patient welfare, compounded by systematic efforts to suppress accountability. Maribel Voss resigned from Ridgway Memorial 2 days before the hearing concluded. The internal review later found she had been aware of at least 4 closed complaints and had actively facilitated their closure without investigation. She faced a separate licensing review before the state nursing board. Patrick Gear was seen leaving the building on a Friday afternoon carrying a box. Ridgway Memorial's board held a special session the following week. Graham Loxley opened with a formal statement of institutional apology to staff whose complaints had been closed without resolution, to patients whose care had been affected, and to employees who had worked in an environment the board acknowledged it had failed to adequately address. Helena Price sat in the front row and listened to the entire statement. 19 years of documentation, 6 years of that accordion folder in the bottom of her locker. Every corner piece, kept and catalogued because she had believed the picture would eventually become clear. After the session, Loxley shook her hand. She accepted it with the composure of a person who had been right for a very long time and had never needed anyone to tell her so. The board voted to restructure the hospital's internal review process, separating complaint resolution from the administrative chain that had allowed department heads to influence their own accountability. It was the kind of reform that should have happened years earlier. It was, at minimum, happening now. Dr. Livia Sloan completed additional procedural training at a regional trauma center. She came back to Ridgway 6 weeks later and ran her first unsupported emergency intervention tension pneumothorax. Different patient, same presentation without hesitation, and without anyone beside her. She told Marin about it in the break room, in the flat tone of someone reporting a data point. Marin poured her a cup of coffee and said, "Good." That was all. It was enough. Tessa Rowe was promoted to charge nurse of the emergency department. She was 26 years old and accepted the position with the seriousness of someone who understood the job was not about authority but about responsibility. She maintained Helena's documentation system reorganized, updated, formalized with the same consistency Helena had brought to the original. Corporal Owen Rusk's unit received redeployment orders on a Thursday. He came by the hospital the evening before they shipped out civilian jacket, no uniform. The laceration above his eye healed to a thin line. He found Marin finishing a shift in the emergency bay. He didn't say much. He stood at the edge of the bay for a moment, and when she looked up, he gave her a single nod, the kind that moves between people who have seen each other in the circumstances that reveal what a person actually is. She had seen it across operating tables and forward stations. She recognized it immediately. She nodded back. He left. Ranger watched him go and then looked back at Marin, untroubled. The offer for Director of Emergency Services came in a formal letter from Graham Loxley, countersigned by the full board. Marin read it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning, Ranger on the floor beside her. She set it down and looked at the window for a while. The same mountain ridgeline she had looked at every morning for 3 years, the view that had meant safety because it meant distance. She thought about the sealed envelope in the back of her closet, the certifications, the commendations, the documentation of a career she had carried in silence, because she had believed that making herself invisible was the same as making herself safe. They weren't the same thing. They had never been the same thing. Invisible was just another word for alone. She picked up the pen and signed the letter. Major Karina Belmont's package arrived the following Tuesday. Inside was a single document, 4 pages, the first 3 dense with procedural language, the fourth containing 2 paragraphs that mattered. The first confirmed that the report filed by combat medic Gray Falcon 7 years prior had been formally entered into the official military record and designated as foundational documentation for the subsequent investigation. The second informed Marin Vale that a commendation for meritorious service recommended at the time of the original report and suppressed during the period of administrative irregularity had been approved for formal issuance. She read both paragraphs twice. Then she folded the document and set it beside Loxley's signed letter. She started the new position on a Monday. She came in through the ambulance entrance at 6:45 a.m. before the day shift change, when the department sat in the quiet interval between overnight volume and the morning surge. The corridor was clean and lit, and smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. Ranger walked beside her, formally transferred to her custody through Belmont's office. Paperwork complete, wearing a service vest the hospital administration had approved with less friction than anyone expected. He stayed close, not anxious, not watchful, simply present. The way he had been years ago, before everything, when she had been Grey Falcon and the world had been harder and in some ways more honest. Marin stopped at the entrance to the bay. The overnight resident was finishing his notes. 2 nurses were restocking the supply cart. A monitor beeped once and settled. She looked at the room, her room now, her responsibility, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of careful, deliberate invisibility. Ready. She walked in. There's something in this story that stays with you after it ends. Marin didn't win because she was loud. She didn't survive because she fought back the moment someone wronged her. She survived because she never stopped doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, even when it cost her, even when the system she trusted buried the evidence and moved on. The truth has a way of surfacing. Not always on schedule, not always in the way we expect, but it finds its moment sometimes through the most unlikely messenger. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. Stories about people who stayed quiet for the right reasons and found their voice at exactly the right time.